Yes, I'm so excited to welcome you to the stage. Is there anything else you would like to share with our audience before we dive in on questions?
Just the big one is drop comments and drop questions into the chat. If there's one takeaway from talking about invisible disabilities today, is that not enough people are asking questions, not enough people are commenting, people aren't saying something doesn't feel right or what doesn't feel right. And so really engaging with me, with your fellow audience members, with all of these other talks today, constantly asking questions and elevating the type of questions is really key.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Okay. So one of the things we wanted to talk about here is the impact of people and their invisible disabilities on their career, their work, their ability for growth. And one of the populations that is incredibly impacted by this is women. So can you talk about maybe why we see this trend, what the trend seems to be, and then, what that impact would be on those groups?
Yeah, so for context, about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, COVID time is weird, maybe more than that even, I started running a survey for women in invisible disabilities to understand what was going on. I myself had hit a particular low point. I have depression and anxiety. I have been on medication for 10 plus years for both of those. And I hit a really bad low at work. I had a bad performance review that I felt was unwarranted. I was in a toxic work culture. My long-term boyfriend just broke up with me, and I was just like, straight down. And I reached out to
So you
someone.
were doing great.
Yeah, right. Like love, life,
Just
great.
crushing it. Yeah.
Um, and I reached out to one of my women's networks, Dreamers and Doers. If you haven't seen Dreamers and Doers, definitely check it out. And said, I can't be the only one feeling like this. I can't be the only one struggling at work and personal and all of these things. What is going on? Has anybody else been here? Does anybody else have any tips or words of advice? And ultimately, I got an incredible outpouring of support. And again, this was a women community. And they said, I've been there. Here's what happened to me. Here's my story. Here's what's going on. You're not alone. Call me, reach out to me, email me, whatever. And I said, okay, nobody's talking about women and invisible disability specifically. And invisible disability, just again, context, can be something related to mental health like mine, depression and anxiety. It could be short term. Maybe somebody temporarily has cancer and recovers. It could be long term, like a chronic illness, Lyme disease. There's a lot of different pieces that fit under the invisible disability umbrella that aren't necessarily recognized by the government. And so really, in my opinion, the best person to identify if they have an invisible disability or not is the individual themselves. Does something that you do not control affect you in a way that disables your ability to work? So I have a very liberal stance on that. So I started this Google survey. It was pretty basic, saying, do you identify with any one of these lists or anything else? How does it impact your work? So on and so forth. And ultimately, there were 3 core themes that came back from this research about women and really what happened with them. And I'm going to pull it up just a second. I have a screenshot from a presentation. The big things that I found out were that the coping skills that these women created in the workplace became their superpowers. Oftentimes women were diagnosed later in their careers or their personal lives with a disability. They had to create better and new strategies rather than the traditional kind of in the box thinking, that out of the box thinking, and learn skills by trying and doing versus just kind of innate. And then there was a lot of overcompensation for these skills to cover and make sure that nobody could see in the cracks in the, what was actually happening. Other piece was stunted career growth. Because there was a lot of self-diagnosis, treatment was often delayed, or, if there anybody who's ever gone to the doctor's office in the body of someone who isn't a cisgendered man, you can recognize that you've probably encountered difficulties or people not believing you or saying your pain isn't this bad or this, that, and the other thing. So folks often didn't get treatment. Like I mentioned, not being part of a protected class, there are some disabilities that are very obviously protected by the government and the ADA laws. But a lot of folks, if you don't identify, if you can't get treatment, if you can't get a diagnosis, you're not covered. And that means that your employer can fire you, especially if you're in an at-will state like New York, and there are other at-will states. And then ultimately, a lot of stigma and a lot of shame often put on themselves, saying, oh, Meg is automatically going to judge me, so I'm not going to tell her anything because I don't want to have that stigma and shame. So putting up wall after wall after wall, in addition to all the steps that an employer brings to the table. And then the biggest win and takeaway from the folks who were talking was that having a safe and supportive community, often specific to an identity, in my case, gender, but whether you are a person of color, Black, or have another, marginalized identity, having that community, digital, in person or not, didn't matter, but having that community was vital. And so in terms of trends and kind of where things are going, I nerd out really hard about ERGs, employee resource groups, affinity groups, BRGs, whatever you want to call them. It's my nerd zone because you're creating ideally these spaces internally at an organization that say, hey, this is a disability friendly space. This is a people of color friendly space. Again, whatever identities, mental health, there's a million ways to have an ERG. And knowing that that third piece of those safe and important communities was such a big piece, to be able to have those inside of the workforce starts to kind of build some cracks into kind of this tech bubble that we've been existing in, the Silicon Bro tech bubble that, you know, many people and not everyone has been living in. So starting to see some shifts, starting to see some trends where those personal and professional spaces are really starting to kind of commingle in a productive way and hopefully stay a productive way. But there still is a tremendous amount of stigma. There still aren't a lot of people talking and saying, hey, I have depression and anxiety, and like, I got out of bed today and my brain doesn't work. I had a day the other day this week, I'm coping with some personal trauma right now. And I got up and I did 2 hours worth of calls and I said, I can't do anything else today. And I canceled all the rest of my calls and literally laid in bed for 6 hours. And my boyfriend got me up for dinner and put me back to bed. And that's my depression and that's my anxiety at work. And that's real. If I were to work through that, you would get really shitty shoddy product, sorry if I'm cursing. And it's not worth having me be live as an employee in that space. Now,
Yeah.
I left the workforce and now work for myself, which is part of some of the issues that I've had, but I'll pause there and happy to.
No, I think you raise a lot of really good points. And we, you know, we're getting comments in the chat thread. So people are absolutely on board with what you're saying. Cecilia had said that they are autistic and have ADHD, and the constant masking or overcompensation causes so much burnout just to exist in the workplace. You know, thank you for sharing your diagnosis with us, Cecilia, as well as Jess. Thank you. I live with bipolar disorder type 2, ADHD, anxiety. What is the other one? There's like a big long stream of something, like, you know what I mean? It's like, I saw a meme the other day that was like, isn't it great how mental illness is basically buy one, get 7 free? And it truly is. Like, you do see these people that have like a lot of stuff going on. And I feel like with women, especially, I mean, we already mask like physical health concerns. It's absolutely something that is recognized. And so the idea of kind of then layering the extra stigma that unfortunately still exists in a lot of places, you know, really puts up incredible barriers to getting help, which not only is going to benefit the individual, but also all of those bubbles they are a part of outside of just themselves. Christina had chimed in saying, as a woman, getting mental health treatment and medication is used against you if you're in a divorce, which puts us in a place to have to work without mental health support when you're already going through something traumatic like a divorce. So yeah, I mean, this makes a ton of sense that, you know, a lot of people would spend their time trying to mask. I mean, before I was diagnosed, I did the same thing, but I didn't realize what I was doing. I thought I was just like pretending to adult the way everybody else pretends to adult.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that's wonderful to hear that, you know, this is something that's being looked at. Can you talk about what that looks like for entrepreneurship? You had talked about how you work for yourself now, as opposed to, you know, working outside of the home or outside of your own org. What does that impact of hiding these invisible disabilities have on entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so for those entrepreneurship external to the current business, entrepreneurship inside a current, if you're working full time. This is, I think, one of the biggest losses for organizations who don't recognize the potential for entrepreneurship. I've worked in L&D, I've worked in DEI, I've worked in HR, and fortunate enough to have a coach who lived next door when I was 18 and started coaching me at the age of 18. And so I try to pay that forward in the workplace, and recognizing that specifically this women with disability community, invisible disability community, gets ignored so often. And so when you think about their talents that are overlooked, when you think about their potential that is overlooked, when they're constantly pushed down, and again, marginalizing this, and I see Sarita put in the chat, she's queer Latin, when you add those other marginalized identities on top, all of this gets expounded. So like, I'm talking from the perspective as cisgendered white woman, I come with a lot of privilege. So for me to be experiencing these pieces, again, then compounded by being a person of color, being a person who doesn't identify on the gender binary, some of these other pieces, it's just going to amplify all of the pieces that I'm saying. So please don't feel left out, because you're being marginalized as well in a different capacity. But so thinking about, you know, when we would say who deserves to get assigned to a special project, to lead a special project, who has the capacity to do so, who has the ingenuity to do so, and women with disabilities are getting left out of the conversation left and right One, because they're not self-nominating oftentimes. I tend to be a bit of a loudmouth. I'm a pretty good self-advocate. I was raised with some really great advocates who I saw and learned their behavior, but most people don't advocate for themselves fully and successfully. And so also there's a huge part of this community saying, how can I advocate for you, Meg? And how can you advocate for me? And being in those shoes and those levels of positions where you can do that. But so organizations are losing out on this entrepreneurship, saying, Meg, I want you to lead this project because I know you have X, Y, and Z, and you're capable of D, E, and F. You go do this and make the company a bunch of money. Because for me, I love all the touchy-feely part about DEI, but DEI is a business objective. If business is like, we've covered this already. There's a zillion articles. Like, if you say like, oh, let's get away from the business case, like, Jesus already, let's move on. And so when you think about the entrepreneurship and people's talents, it may not align with how you think or how you do stuff. And Jackie, I see you mentioned autism in the chat. It's a huge undervalued community because we don't know how their brains work well because science. And then people with autism, we don't know how their brains work well in business because nobody said, hey, actually, there's an organization called Divergent, DAI Vergent. Spelling is not my thing, but I know the founders is specific to autistic workforce and supporting organizations with an autistic workforce. So, and in tech specific fields. So him and his company are the experts on saying, how do these minds work and how can they best support organizations? But not enough people are asking those questions.
Yeah.
So everybody who's here today, those are the questions I say, hey, could somebody with autism bring something to the table that we don't already have? Could someone with a disability bring something to the table that we don't already have? And the answer almost always is going to be yes.
Yeah, because you're looking for that culture gap, right? You're trying to figure out what is not represented in that room yet.
Exactly.
Yeah. I love that. We're getting a lot of comments in the chat thread about, like you had said, not nominating yourself, not being an advocate for yourself. Christina had said, I think the most ironic part of having mental illness is when you finally find groups or communities that accept and understand you, the self-doubt is still rampant.
Yeah.
I relate to this hard, like, because I mean, granted, like, ADHD, anxiety, depression, these are becoming much more understood and more recognized and more shared experiences. Mm-hmm. But it's always a concern that I have is by either sharing that I'm bipolar with someone, like, are they going to see me or are they going to immediately think of, whatever examples they've seen in movies or television or whatever, like, are they going to see me or are they going to see a crazy person? Is that how they're going to
diagnosis first versus people first?
Exactly. Well, and even then, like we've talked to a couple experts today, there were some people that very much still use people first language. And there are other like entire companies that really believe that identity first is important because you want to see that person for what they are, for who they are. Yep. So yeah, I mean, like there are so many different ways to cover this depending on what your preference is personally.
And I just want to echo that specifically for identity first, saying I am a woman who is, or I am a person who has a disability versus I am a disabled person. Go with whatever the person says. And don't ask them, do you prefer person first or identity first or disability first? Because just like most other things in this world, it's not a black and white. It's not like this is the correct answer and this is not, but some people feel really awkward, just like pronouns. Hey, Meg, I don't know your pronouns. Can you share those with me? Same thing. Hey, you identified as being disabled. Do you do disability first? Just ask. If you have any questions, most people are very, very open to just saying, oh yeah, this is how I go by. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, on my part, I've done the same thing where I try and assume good intent, especially if people say something that's like not really the way I prefer to say it. But I mean, like, I think like everybody has those kinds of things and sometimes they'll make sense to you and sometimes they won't, but it doesn't matter. You're supposed to listen to the person, like technically I have a mental illness. Like it's not even technically, it's true. I don't like to be referred to as mentally ill. Yeah. Can't explain to you why. Doesn't matter that it's accurate. It's absolutely truthful, but like, it's just not something I prefer. And so, asking these questions and kind of checking, like keeping up with that gut check of like, hey, am I doing this correct for you? Is this how you prefer to have it done? Is like so important. Let's talk about that vulnerability, right? That it really takes to be able to speak about, these things as they impact your career. How can companies or how can teams cultivate a safe space for people with disabilities so that they are free to have that vulnerability to say, what they need or what they are dealing with that day?
Yeah. So I started using the phrase DIBA there's a zillion acronyms of DEIJ, DEIB, there's a zillion ones. I started using DEBA specifically to add that accessibility piece in. And I like to talk about accessibility not from the perspective of disability, but from the perspective of everybody works differently and everybody does their best work in different environments. And accessibility is about enabling everybody to do their best work. I know there's another panelist or speaker today, Hannah Olson, who is the founder of Disclo, which is an organization that helps employers get accommodations for their employees in a stigma-free way. And fair disclosure, I advise the organization, so I'm very close and very intimate with them and what their product is. And one of the reasons I do advise them is because the potential was there, because nothing was filling that gap to say, how does everybody do their best work and how do we enable that from a literal systems? Like I just went to pick up my laptop, like from a systems, my monitor, my laptop. And my own personal example is back in when I was doing recruitment, I think better when moving, like physically moving my legs. And so when my company offered me some stipend for work from home when COVID happened, I got an under the desk treadmill, and I'm not using it right now because I don't do it on this. And it folds up and it goes right under my bed. It was like $300 on Amazon, and I try not to promote buying from Amazon, but whatever. And I think better when moving. And so when I'm in meetings, when I'm discussing, especially when I'm not the main person speaking, I'm on that treadmill. One, it's healthy, gets me exercise. I live in the middle of boonies in New Hampshire. There's nowhere to walk, run, move, anything. So it gets me movement, gets me some exercise, some endorphins. And two, it just helps me work better. Is that technically an accommodation for a disability? I could probably make an argument for it because if it releases endorphins, that helps my disability of depression and anxiety, and it makes me at ease, blah, blah, blah. I can do the trail, but I shouldn't have to. And that's for me what, there's some straight up accommodations. If you have a hearing loss issue, you should have headphones that allow you to hear better, or, make sure that there is closed captioning on absolutely everything that could possibly have closed captioning. Others are a little looser. But when you think, especially in this remote world, if I am building my workstation, I have my standing desk, that enables me to do better work, which means that Meg, if you were my employer, you're getting better value. Your ROI out of me is much higher. Just by spending $300-$400 on me for my perfect desk situation, what happens if I'm 10, 20, 30, 500xing that? And what happens if you do that for every person? Not just every person with a disability, but every person in your organization had the workstation that allowed them to do their best work. Yeah. And so shifting that dynamic, going back to vulnerability, when's the last time you heard one of your C-suite members say, I have a disability, or I have a mental health condition, or I need just to take a break because I'm exhausted?
That one's just as powerful. Seriously, you don't have to be mentally ill or have like a disability or diagnosis to relate to people, right? Being like transparent about like, hey, stuff's not going great today. I need a mental break. That is fine. That's great. I love to see that. I love to see that modeled for people.
Yep. We're starting to also see a trend. I believe LinkedIn just did it, and maybe Nike just did it. And actually my org, even though we're only 20 people, we're doing it, of giving a mental health week or just a week off. And more companies are getting into that practice of saying, this is not part of your PTO. We just want to say, take the week. And that just seems like the biggest obvious, like, duh, of course you would do that. Like, why wouldn't you? Instead of saying, okay, you go on vacation this week and you go on vacation this week and you go on vacation this week, and then it's a total cluster when everybody comes back because everybody was off at different times, which still should happen, but give everybody a week or two a year where you just say, this is time off. This is space for you. You don't have to say this is a mental health day. You don't have to say this is a vacation day. Like, you do you. Those kinds of pieces are really important. There's been a lot of conversation about, should you put like a mental health day in your HRIS system for people to choose? The answer is maybe, but probably not, because you don't want people to have to say, well, am I doing a mental health day? Am I taking a day off? Is this just because I'm tired? Like, people just need time off, done. If you want to say, hey, for our data, would you categorize this as a sick day, as a mental health day, as a vacation day? Sure, but you shouldn't require that. People should be able to take the time they need. So by putting in systems and structures, such as Disclo, such as, hey, we don't make you say if you're specifically taking a mental health day, you can just take a day. Sharing examples of how people take PTO. A lot of startup world have a limited PTO and people don't take it. And, it's a tactic to get people to take less PTO. It sounds cool and sexy. I'm a big advocate of minimum time off. At this company, we have unlimited time off, but we require you to take 4 weeks off a year consecutive, like 4 consecutive weeks. Why aren't organizations implementing that? And then you say, oh, well, I can take 1 week off a quarter. So having minimum PTO, every manager should be required to know exactly, have a chart, have a dashboard, whatever, of exactly how much time off their direct reports have taken. And when was the last time? And if they haven't taken a day off in 30 days, you should say you need to take the next Friday off. You need to take a 4-day weekend. It doesn't have to be a week-long thing, but telling people how they can appropriately take PTO in a way that is appropriate for their health, not appropriate usage by the company standards, but for their own health. So there are some really easy, like light switch things you can do. Hey, let's just say minimum time off. Boom. Then how do you track it? Next step, boom. You have a dashboard, boom. Like these are all things that are in systems we already have. This does not require new systems to track this or ask people to do this.
Oh, I love that. I very much like the idea of being able to kind of plug and play. I feel like a lot of people feel that this is a very arduous thing to tackle, and it doesn't have to be, right? It does not, you don't have to make it, make that molehill into a mountain before you tackle it.
Yep.
And thank you so much for calling out, you do DEIBA, so disability, equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility. I think accessibility has definitely been left off that for way too long. So very, very important to recognize the importance of all of those factors.
Yep.
All right, let's talk about how people or how orgs can improve these inclusionary best practices, but have a focus on employees that often won't disclose invisible disabilities. I did this in past roles where I didn't want to call attention to whatever I had going on. And so like we talked about earlier, I would mask, or I would, work around it, find some other way that I could, kind of work on things on my end so that from outside, it was not apparent that I was struggling or that I needed something else. What do you think needs to happen to improve these best practices for all employees?
Yeah, the phrase "what's good for the goose is good for the gander," which is such a weird phrase anyway, but that comes to mind of what's good for a disabled employee is often good for a regular employee. Regular, and again, regular, I use terms normal, like
average,
but nobody is regular, especially not when it comes to disability. Like there's so many kind of anomalies. But thinking about, if you assume that every employee is masking, go into the situation and assume that and say, what can we do to get people to do their best work, to disclose to the appropriate people when they need to? And that does not mean saying, hey, company, I have depression, but it might be saying, hey, manager Meg, I just wanted to let you know that this is I have depression and this is how it manifests, and I will keep you apprised if something happens. That's disclosure to a specific person versus an entire org. There's also disclosing on a company level. Everybody talks about the EEOC survey, EEOC, I don't know what it stands for, but
Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Thank you. Yeah, so the EEOC,
that sounds right.
Yeah, where they ask, are you a woman? Are you a man? How do you identify? Are you this? Are you that? When I did the survey, let's see, I'm finding the stat here. 57% of those said they'd not asked for reasonable accommodations. People didn't even know the term. A lot of people opted out of that question because they didn't even know the term reasonable accommodations. What can I even ask for in the workplace? So just like everything else I got to talk about, it's about transparency, it's about communication, and it's about documentation. Every organization says, hey, if you need a reasonable accommodation, this is how we define, or this is how the government defines reasonable accommodation. And if you are a multinational organization, I suggest going with the most liberal laws versus the most conservative laws. So to US, somewhere in the middle there. But say this is how, if you have a disability, here's 5 things you can do. You can disclose to your manager. Here's some LinkedIn learnings to do that. Here's what you can do if you want to ask for reasonable accommodation. If we have this, or use Disclo or anything else to get, here's some things that we automatically offer that you can just say, I want that. You don't even have to say I have a disability, but hey, I could use a screen reader, or I could do something
desk. There's a lot of these things.
And so if, as an organization, you just automatically say, like, if you need this, just ask for it. We're not going to ask questions. We're going to assume that you need it, because that's an employer. How many employers out there when you first get hired send out and say, hey, what equipment do you need? Instead of saying, here's your MacBook, what happens if you said, hey, we offer you $1,000 for a computer stipend and we offer these things. Do you have any preferences? Ask that before their start date, so it shows up on day one. There's a lot of little things that really don't cost a lot of money. Of course, there are a lot of accommodations that can cost $1 zillion, but if you just say, hey, start here, and if you need more, this is the process. Document it. They should be part of training. If you have a learning management system or an LMS, right in there from day one. If you don't, PowerPoint it is, and just have it be really easy. Have it on an intranet, have it linked. Make sure that anybody can access it from day 1 to day 1,000, which hopefully you're there for more than 1,000 days. Modern employers, let's see what's going on.
Yeah. No, I'm loving everything I'm hearing here. I keep getting distracted by the chat because I'm seeing all of the wonderful messages from people in there. Celia was saying that they're jealous because they have terrible PTO and feel like they're having to make kind of chess moves anytime you need time off. Yep. And for anybody with, with a disability or a condition that is not static, this is even harder, right? Because you don't know from one day to the next. I'm personally a huge fan of spoon theory. It's a pretty well-known idea, but I'll share some links in case you're curious. But it's this idea that you never know how much, like how much energy or how much resources you're going to start the day with, right? You might have 3 spoons that have to get you through the day, and you start the day with 3. But then what happens tomorrow when you don't wake up with 3? Right? You gotta keep doing things. You gotta kind of borrow against time. It's rough, right? And so I feel like a lot of the time, just trying to get people who are not impacted by these issues, trying to get them to understand that, like, it's a moving target. I'm going to tell you what I can to get accommodations that'll help, but it's also about the employer having like good expectations, right? Being understanding about what the situation is. I might know. Oh, go ahead, please.
Focusing on outcomes, not actions.
Yes.
What is your role and what are the expected outcomes? A lot of companies absolutely suck at goals. They absolutely suck at goal setting. They absolutely suck at metrics. And that's one of the things we go through. And people are like, when we do our DEI audits or engagement survey audits, they say, you're making recommendations that have nothing to do with DEI. And I'm like, pause.
But they do.
Exactly, do, because if somebody doesn't know how they need to perform in order to get a promotion or a raise, how do you expect them to perform to that ability? Then it's all arbitrary. And so getting really specific and being really clear, and for the person who has bad PTO, start talking, saying, hey, our PTO sucks, and if you feel comfortable identifying, or you can say, hey, from the perspective of somebody who might have this identity, this PTO could be really frustrating, and we might be limiting our candidates. And we talk about, ultimately, all this comes back to is like, hey, can we get more diverse candidates into our pipeline? Hate that. But if you can go and say on your careers page, we offer a $500 build your own at work stipend. We offer flexible blank. We offer a mental health reimbursement. Even if our insurance doesn't cover it, we're going to offer $30 a session. You do it through this anonymous portal, blah, blah, blah. If you say that on your careers page, you better believe the folks with disabilities, you better believe the folks with mental illness, to believe the folks who are parents, who are birthing parents, are going to say, oh shit, that is where I want to work. And that's right? What the employer says they want, but they don't take the actions toward.
Yeah, no, I think that's key, and it really does highlight what we've been talking about, is those best practices to bring in these people, this talent that you want to, you want to make the most of. It's a little bit of that kind of field of dreams mentality, right? You build it before you can expect them to show up. People aren't going to go stand in a field because you told them there's going to be a baseball diamond in 6 weeks or whatever, right? So I think that is huge. We are almost out of time today. I'm so sorry. We had great questions in the chat thread. We tried to get to as many as possible, but Jes, where can people follow up with you if they are interested in learning more about what you do, want to support? What should people know?
I'm one of like 7 Osrows in the world and on LinkedIn. So if you search Osrow, you're going to find me. I'm pretty prolific on there. That's probably the easiest place to connect. The Rise Journey, just like it sounds, online. We really work to close the gap between organizational development and DEI or DEBA, and really make sure that organizations are thinking holistically about this, especially when it comes to, attraction, retention, and engagement of women and folks with disabilities, particularly. Really making sure that they're recognizing that, again, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. What's good for an employee who is marginalized, who is of color, who is of this and that and the other thing, is good for all employees. And so recognizing that good employee engagement is good employee engagement. And find me, talk to me. I do a lot of just chats. I have my booking link on there. Would love to talk to anybody about this. Sales call, not sales call, all the things. And if you know your workplace needs accommodations, check out Disclo. I cannot say how excited I am that they are just really democratizing accessibility for the average worker.